Hi, welcome to episode 2 of the Connection Educational Video Series. My name is Aaron Bailey, and today we're actually going to be talking a little bit about some basic snare drum technique, how we hold the sticks, how we motivate strokes, what muscles we use, all of that fun stuff if you're just getting started with snare drum. So the first thing I want to talk about is the right hand grip. So the right hand, we would hold the same way that if you've heard of match grip or if you have any experience with match grip, it's that same technique. We're going to hold the stick with what we call a fulcrum between our pointer finger and our thumb. So what that means is that we have a strong connection with the stick so that we're able to rotate the stick around that point. A common analogy you may hear, if you were to drive a nail through your thumb, it should come out your pointer finger like so. So beyond that, we're just going to wrap our middle finger, ring finger, pinky fingers around the stick. We don't want to be squeezing the stick like crazy, but we do want to have some contact with the stick. We want to have a connection there. That'll just give us control and then allow us to leverage that fulcrum and use that right hand grip. So the next thing I want to talk about before we start talking about how we're actually using that grip to produce a stroke is the left hand grip. So if I'm starting with somebody that has never played traditional grip before, I would ask you reach out your left hand like you're going to shake somebody's hand. You can take the stick and then put it in that crease between your thumb and the rest of your hand. From there, you wrap your pinky and your ring finger around underneath the stick, kind of as one idea. They stay connected so that the stick actually rests on the cuticle of your ring finger, so where the nail meets the skin. So honestly, you could play with this grip. You have the support from the bottom and you have your thumb on top. But to give us a little more control and the ability to use some more finger control, play some different techniques, we're going to take the pointer finger and middle finger, wrap those around the top of the stick. So all of these fingers, except for the pinky, are connected to the stick, and we're going to want to have a connection between our thumb and pointer finger that never separates. For 99% of what we do, you're going to want to keep that connected. We know a little bit more about the grip now, so we should talk about how we should actually set up our hands, set up our sticks relative to the drum. So the first thing that I want to talk about is beads of your drumsticks. So you want them to be as close to each other and as close to the drum head as possible without running into each other, without making some extra noise. You don't want to hear this sort of stuff. But you want it to be as close as possible, just so it looks clean. You're in the center of the head, so you'll get a consistent sound when you do play. You'll just build good habits at having the beads in the center of the drum. As far as this angle, or the angle from the back of the stick to the bead, you want it to be just a slight downward angle. So sometimes people will talk about a 2-finger rule between the rim and the stick. Really anything between 1 and 2 fingers, I would say, would be a good angle to have. What you don't want to have is a very steep angle of the sticks. When that happens, you get a low pitch, just really not a good sound out of the snare drum. The sticks don't want to resonate, so you want to make sure that you're hitting on the good part of the bead. As far as drum height, so if you are going to set up a snare drum and you're not sure exactly how high it should be, you should use your left hand as a reference. So you may notice snare drummers, quad drummers, wear their drums at a little different height relative to their bodies. The reason being this grip right here. So with a snare drum, if your drum's too low, your forearm is angled way down like that, it makes it nearly impossible to turn your wrist and have good technique. So what you do want to look for is a nearly flat angle to your forearm, maybe slightly downward from your elbow to your wrist. That way, it'll be a lot easier for you to turn your wrist. At that point, you may feel yourself kind of sticking your right elbow out. That's natural, just because the height is a little bit higher than if you were to just be playing two hands match grip. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about where our beads should be on the head. We've talked about this angle of our sticks and keeping our hands low enough to the drum that we don't want to hit the rim, but we don't want to be on top of the bead. Let's talk a little bit more about how our hands are set up. If you were to take a look down from a bird's eye view, you would like your sticks to create a 90-degree angle, and that should be symmetrical on both sides. A habit that's really easy to get into is kind of shifting that clockwise. So your right hand would be a little too close to your body, a little bit too steep. Your left hand would be pushed out a little bit. That creates closer to a 90-degree angle on your left hand. So in order to fight that, you'll need to think about pulling your elbow back a little bit on your left arm. So that creates a larger obtuse angle between your forearm and your left stick, and just getting that right elbow pushed out. So if you're new to this, you'll probably feel your right shoulder burning a little bit, but that's okay. That's just another muscle that you'll build along with every other muscle that you use to create strokes and play snare drum. So we're looking for this nice symmetrical stick setup. So depending on what drum you're playing on, the lugs might be set up a little bit differently. However, if you are playing on a Ludwig drum like we are, it's going to look like your sticks are just a little bit outside of these lugs right here. So it's not the two closest lugs to you, but it's the next pair of lugs out from that. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what muscles we're using, how we produce a stroke, what good technique looks like. So rule number one, it's kind of all-encompassing. If you get this down, it'll help you figure out which muscles to use and what right technique feels like. So the first thing to move should be the bead of the stick. So we don't want to see your wrist come up first or your elbow come up first or anything besides that bead. So if you watch me upstroke to play a note, the bead moves first. Same goes for the left hand. And what I'm actually using is my wrist. So depending on what you're playing, you may be using a little bit more arm, a little bit more weight from your arm, or if it's something that's really fast, then you're going to need to use smaller muscles like your fingers, maybe a little kind of twitch muscles. But if at all possible, you're going to want to use muscles in your wrist. The reason being is it's just the most consistent way to play. It's a pretty big muscle group, but it also keeps the technique looking clean and consistent. I want to go ahead and talk about the different stroke types that we have. There are only 4 of them. So those strokes are full, down, tap, and up. So what I mean when I say full stroke, I mean that the stroke starts up here and it ends up here. In other words, you play a full stroke and allow the stick to rebound afterwards so that the stick stops in the same place. This would be the technique that you use, or the stroke type that you use if you're playing legato strokes, which I think can be a confusing term at times. We're actually not playing any sound that is legato. Rather, the motion of the stick from top to bottom is a legato motion. So notice whenever I play that technique, I'm not stopping the stick and then using my wrist muscles to lift the stick back up. It's more like dribbling a ball. So all I have to do is throw the stick down. Now, depending on what surface you're playing on, you may have more or less rebound. The stick should be able to bounce back up. All you have to do is make sure that your hand is out of the way so that the stick can rebound on its own. So those are full strokes. That's the first stroke type. The next stroke type would be a downstroke. So if you're playing an accent and the stick needs to stop down, maybe you're playing some taps right after the accent, you're going to play a downstroke. So notice the only difference is after the actual note. Instead of rebounding back up, the stick stops down. What a lot of people want to do is squeeze the stick so that it'll stop down. And it may be hard to tell in this video, but there actually is a pretty big difference in sound quality if you play a note with a relaxed hand versus really squeezing the stick. A lot of the sound from a drum comes from the resonance of the stick. So you want to, as I kind of explained with the grips, you do want to have contact. You want to have flesh on the stick, all the fingers wrapped around to stop the stick, but just with more of a soft, relaxed hand, if that makes sense. So those are downstrokes. The next kind of stroke would be a tap stroke. So a tap stroke would be anything that starts and ends low, whether that's a piano stroke 3 inches, but it's a soft note and the stick stays down after the stroke. Okay, so the fourth and final kind of stroke that we're going to talk about is actually an upstroke. So the first half of that stroke is going to be identical to the tap stroke. The stick starts low. After the beat hits the head, we're actually going to upstroke back to that accent height. So this would be a useful skill if you need to play taps before an accent, invert flams, anything like that would require you to quickly upstroke so that you can play the next accent. So a really good exercise to get comfortable with all four strokes would be full down, tap up, and just as you might have guessed, you'll play full down, tap up all in a row. And what that looks like is 2 accents and 2 taps repeated. So full, down, tap, up. Or on the left. So as far as creating the stroke, I know I talked about turning your wrist. That is probably a #1 comment for somebody learning how to play drums in a rudimental style. It's just learning how to turn your wrist rather than just using your arms to lift or just your fingers. That's a really important skill, really important muscle to develop. On the right hand, it looks like a wrist break. So you'll actually be turning your wrist up. Now you don't want to have a stiff or a tense forearm. If it moves a little bit because your wrist is moving, that's fine. But the key thing to take away is that the stroke is motivated from the wrist. So in other words, if this moves kind of sympathetically to your wrist, that's fine. You just don't want the stroke to start there. With the left hand, turning your wrist looks more like turning your entire arm. So if you were to, I've heard the analogy of opening a doorknob. That's how you actually turn the stick up. And that's something that actually is pretty difficult to do, feels pretty awkward, and something that you'll probably have to develop that flexibility. So I know I've done this a lot of the times, just kind of maybe using my right hand to stretch out a little bit, or if you play some big legato strokes, actually the force of the stick rebounding will help kind of stretch your wrist out a little bit so you can turn your left hand higher. That's one of the hardest things we have to do as rudimental snare drummers, is figure out this left hand grip. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you got something out of the video. Be sure to subscribe below and tune back in 2 weeks for episode 3.